the 28th player in my 50 most relevant. He's a part of Hawthorn, Dylan Moore. Is he the only Hawk to appear in the 50? You know he's not. We had Will Day just a few days ago. But for the past few years, he's always been around the mark of a premium tier forward. And could he be the Isaac Heaney and Dane Zorko of last year? Not in the sense of drastic role changes, but the forward that we look at, we discount upside, and he runs away and becomes a smash-out pick? Or is he just going to hover like he has the last few years? We will talk about those outputs, those potential outcomes, and more on this episode of the 50 Most Relevant. Joining me on this episode, he's a regular part of the coaches panel. You've also seen him as a regular member also of the AFL Fantasy Fanatics. It's Jordox. Hello, mate. How are you? An interesting forward for us to dissect. Maybe not so much for whether we're going to have him by the end of the year, but the conversation is he a unique place to start in 2025?
G'day, mate. Yeah, good one to talk about in the forward line. There's a lot of sort of obvious picks, I think, in the forward line this year, and this guy hasn't really been talked about at all, if I'm honest. So yeah, good to be on, have another chat. I can't believe we're nearly halfway through the 50. Time flies when you're smashing out a pot a day, isn't it?
Yes, there's a few people in my household that might argue with me, but we'll see how we go with that. Hey, let's jump into some of the previous seasons and what he did specifically in 2024. An average of 92 in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team means he's coming in as the most expensive forward in the game for you in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team. A seasonal average of 944,000 in AFL Fantasy, just a touch over that 930,000 marker in Dream Team. By the way, his top score in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team was a 138 back in 2022, and he was basically a kick and a mark away from that last year. He did it against the Blues. It was a 132. While in SuperCoach, a little bit higher average, a 97.7, comes in at the price tag of just over $526,000. And his career high score was also his season high score for us last year, 169 against the Adelaide Crows. There's so much about Dylan Moore that is just such an incredible story, Jordox. He's less than a handful of years ago, is delisted by the club, looks to be lost in the football purgatory, and now he's knocking on the door of one of the best pressure and work rate and small forwards in the game. He's not just an exclusive inside 50 man that kicks goals and locks it in. He does that, but then he runs up the ground, gets involved in the defensive efforts, then runs hard the other way and gets involved in the scoring chains. Well, we don't often look at pure forwards that have only forward roles in our fantasy teams. Dylan Moore over the past couple of years is probably someone that we should consider because he does break a lot of the molds for us.
He's the perfect fantasy forward, really. I mean, he's not reliant on goals to get his scores. He still kicks plenty, but he's not relying on big pack marks. He's just your perfect forward for this game that we love in fantasy because he gets up the ground, as you said. He gets on the end of a lot of chains. He helps set up a lot of the play. He reminds me a little bit of a Tom Lynch from a few years ago at the Crows, the way he connects the play. And yeah, he's just a great player. And the other thing that strikes me with him is, he's had such a journey already, like you said, but he's still only, 25? He's still got a lot of footy ahead of him too. So he's really only just entering his prime.
Yeah, it's true. And it looks like the team that he's a part of is only now just entering the edge of what they might become. Last year, he was 5th in the league for goal assists per game. And he was also top 10 in the league for score involvement. So here's this guy that while he's a goal kicker, he's not the goal kicker for the Hawks, but it's the work that he's doing in and around that really is changing the game. Last year, that AFL fantasy average of 92 consisted of 8 tons, 3 over 120. And there was a slow patch to the year, and that was where a lot of his sub-80 scores came. And yet still, despite that, he's entering 2025 with a bunch of pretty big-name forwards that depart, as we do see every year. He's the number one forward by average and total points in that format. While for SuperCoach, wow, 97.7. 10 tons, 5 over 120. And he's got a greater ceiling in SuperCoach that I think we give him credit for. A 139, another 139, a 140, plus that 169 that he had against the Crows. He's the number one forward entering into 2025 by points, and second to only a Jason Horne-Francis by average. And his last 3 years, Jordox has been great. 92, 88, 93 in fantasy, 97, 91, 94 if you want to play the rounding game. Like, he's a top-tier forward, whether the Hawks are playing rubbish ball or hawk ball. He, over the last 3 years, has been in and around the edges of a top-line forward for us. And people would look at him and go, he's just reliable, he's just consistent, there's no upside. But in the last 9 games of the year, he goes at an average of 104.6 and a 105.3 in SuperCoach when the Hawthorn game was steamroll. And if you think that that trend that ended the year is how the Hawks will commence their start to 2025, then, ladies and gentlemen, while he offers you consistency, there is your upside.
And a point of difference too, which is what we're always looking for. I think when I was thinking about this episode with you, Dylan Moore, trying to describe him, he's just the perfect example of you get what you pay for. He's so consistent. And, you mentioned the last 3 years, even going back to 2020, that was his first year sort of averaging, if you play the 1.25 game, it was up around 90 as well. So we've pretty much got a guy who for 4 years is averaged between, in AF and DT, between 84 and 94 pretty much for 4 years. And whether he has a slow start to the season, he finishes it well, or he might have a hot start to the season and then he dips. He always seems to average sort of the same. So in terms of him being an option, I just don't know if we're ever going to see more than what he's doing. Pardon the pun, didn't mean that. But because he's sort of, this looks like what he is. If there was a pathway to more midfield time or something like that, you could see his average going up, but I don't see his role changing. I think what Hawthorn did last year worked so well, there will just be more of the same. So does that mean he's a bad pick? Of course not. But he's just the perfect example of what he's valued at is what you're going to get from him. So you can do it because you know what you're going to get. And there's not much risk.
No, well, that's it. We talked about throughout this series through the 50 most relevant man about what's the risk profile you're prepared to build into your side and where does that come? And so often we look at stable selections, which more all indications would suggest he's one of the more stable suggested premium options you can go for. We kind of find a way to deviate away from stability, but you do need some anchors in your team. Now, I'm not talking about paying up for a guy that's not going to move the needle in terms of scoring a price. When I say anchor, that's not what I mean. What I'm talking about is something that you go, barring an injury, I'm certain this will take place. Therefore, I'm going to anchor my team with that. And the risk profile isn't around an injury or a value, quote unquote, that is craziness that sits through there. So there is a case to be made to at least consider in the preseason. And that's what you should use the months of January and February for, is scoping and scouting all the shapes and sizes of how your team could make up, because the case for consistency with Moore is strong. The pathway of upside, as you mentioned last year, that final run, a few pockets of 23 and in 22, he's putting runs together of 4, 6, 8 weeks of well over 100 plus. And so if he starts that way, you're ahead. You've got a unique. You're not building in a risk element to your side. And I think at least in the preseason, it's worth a look. It's worth a consideration, much like, okay, if you're a set and forget truther, have you looked at what your team looks like going for a couple of ruck options? Conversely, if you're all for value, have you had a look at what it looks like with changing the shape of your side? Play around with it. Get a look. Don't just get locked into one specific thing, but try and see what can sit there. Because, Jordox, when I look at this forward line consensus of the community, and groupthink has well and truly always been alive in the fantasy football community, but with so much visibility, so many great content creators, so much shared knowledge or copy and pasted reflections of people's favourite content creator, I can see a pretty standard forward line across the formats, and that being Caleb Daniel sitting in there, perceived undeniable value. Philippou, if he gets that midfield role we saw last year, and even when he didn't have it, perceived undeniable value. A Bailey Smith with a free and uninterrupted pre-season, perceived undeniable value. And Jackson McRae, who's been a star of the fantasy footy world for the better part of his entire career, moved into a side with a perceived value space. I can see those four being a highly popular combination. It feels like it's just vanilla scoops of ice cream when it comes to our forward lines this year. Is it worth a look at a shake-up of getting a consistent option that does show runs of upside and anchors something in at F1 that's a little bit different and isn't quote-unquote value? Is that worth a consideration, do you think?
Everything's got to be on the table, certainly at this point of the year when we haven't even seen, a pracky match or anything like that. I think you can't. You were saying before, if you're set on something, you consider the other side of it because, well, we've got so much time to fiddle with our teams. It'd be silly not to consider all angles. I think with the forward line, it's funny. I think we had this a few years ago, didn't we? When there was just it was kind of a different setup to this year where it's value guys, but you had Rosie, you had Butters, you had Canelio, you had was Trelaw forward at one point,
Dunkley.
Golden, Taranto.
Yeah, it was everybody. Yeah.
So that was similar. And I look at this year, and nearly every side you see has that four, and even the on-field kids are essentially the same. But I guess what I'd say on that is, there's such a fine line between doing something that's different for the sake of doing something that's different, or doing something that's different because you really believe that's the way to go. We talk a lot. I hear a lot about groupthink and, almost in a negative sense. But often groupthink comes because it's logical and it's based on, the value of it. I mean, I defy anyone to tell me Caleb Daniel's not a good pick if he has that role. Anyone to tell me Bailey Smith's not a good pick if he's the main man at Geelong at those prices. It's just absurd. How do you not pick it? And a few years ago, many years ago, actually, I remember looking at my team in pre-season and thinking, oh, it's too similar to everyone's. I'm going to mix it up. And I made some changes. And that just hurt me. So I think the real point of difference is in the trading in this game. So don't be worried if your forward line looks like everyone else's. It's the trades you make that'll change it. And jumping on Dylan Moore after he has one of his 60s and his price dips slightly and then they have a good run, that's the move, and that's the way to be different to the rest of the crowd.
If you want to go back and listen to the episode we did with Pig Mentality, we did some around Will Day. We did this analysis of what the Hawthorn fixture looks like. And again, it was run across the 2024 opposition data, which, again, I'll put it on the table. Outside of Richmond, where I feel confident to say last year's trend is going to be similar to 2025's. Everybody else, I think there's at least an option to consider improved or a decreased scoring coming against some of these oppositions. So yes, we might still see an ease of West Coast scoring. We might still see an ease of Geelong rucks or whatever it is. But outside of the Richmond fixture, I don't confidently lock that in as a really handy matchup. But we did look at it from a 2024 lens over the first few months of 2025. And timing is everything, as you mentioned in this game. Trading, who to pick, when do you pick them, when you start them, when you jump off them. It's as much as a trading game, it's a timing game. And if you're going to start Dylan Moore, he's there. The narrative you start is either, I think, the end of the year is what's the new normative, or I'm getting him as the anchor and he's going to be a consistent strong piece. If that's the case, he has to start at his average at least. And I look at this early fixture, which does have an early bye, and it does look a little challenging for me. Now, we get the Swans in opening round. we get a look and see the role. I'm like you, I'm not concerned. He's going to play high half forward, push up and down the flanks. He'll play as an extra mid, but never actually get centre bounce or wing role opportunities. But we at least get to know, okay, what's this price movement trending towards? Bombers, potentially favourable. Blues, okay. Giants, yeah. Buy. The power on gather round, and then the Cats is where it does start to slowly turn the corner. And pretty much from there on, by the way, that's a really nice fixture junction if the 2024 trends hold. It's a lot of confidence that the Hawks are going to maintain. Teams have not done their work as well as they could have last year. The narrative of holding or improving his scoring to me feels harder to believe than, look, I'll just wait 5 weeks, know what the forwards movements are doing, and then jump on after that early buy as one of my first upgrades. Because as you said, win, lose, draw, he somehow by the end of the year ends up in the same spot. And if he starts slow, that gives me confidence that the hot stretch is coming.
That's right. And the Hawks themselves aren't, they're not really big fantasy scorers in the last few years anyway. They're really good at spreading the load. So I know that Dylan Moore does fill his boots in the games where they win big, but they do share it around a lot. And there's not a lot of big fantasy scores for Hawks as well.
No, it's true. Look, if he starts strong, and you'll get a good indication of that with opening round, okay, maybe you can run the gauntlet. But if he starts slow, don't cool off him buying low on a guy that for now, 4 years, has been a 90s guy across the formats in a line that we're going, look, we feel confident in the top 2 or 3 of what they'll be. And then after that, it's scattergun of options. Whether you're trying to start him because you're trying to force a point of difference in your starting squad, or you're viewing him as an upgrade option, I'm very, very confident that barring injury, Dylan Moore is going to be in and around the mark of one of the best forward options for us yet again in 2025. And whether you start or purely look to him as an upgrade option, he has to be someone you are looking at in your teams at some point in 2025, which ultimately is how he's ended up in this spot inside the 50 most relevant. But on draft day, all other those elements go away. As I said, he's the second average SuperCoach forward by rank and the number 1 forward in AFL Fantasy by rank. I'm not too sure that will be the spot he gets taken on draft day. Here at the Coaches Panel, we choose to draft on the Keeper platform. Whether you do a single season, dynasty, or a Keeper league, it can all be done with unrivaled customization. It is the place to draft in 2025. Where do you see him going on draft day, Jordox? Like, it's hard to see him, Jason Horne-Francis, across the formats, going after him. It's hard to see in SuperCoach, Rankin not getting taken before him, and probably Bailey Smith in AFL Fantasy. It's hard to see kind of those 2 options in those scoring formats feel like the more likely guys to go ahead of Moore, but there is a case to make for consistency in a draft selection too. So where does he go on draft day, and is he a tier 1 forward for you?
Yeah, he's a perfect draft guy because of, you know, what you're going to get throughout the year. You can really count on him. And what's great about him too, even though he has the top average in AF and I think second average in SuperCoach, I don't think he'll be the first pick forward. As you just said, there's other guys with a lot more hype. And that's what's perfect about Moore, is you could probably get him as maybe even the 3rd or 4th forward off the board. You've got your F1, you know, if you sit a little bit later than others and get your F1 as Dylan Moore, like, you're laughing. Like, he's a really good get, and I think that'd be a pretty smart strategy. Let the others take the punt on the more popular guys and then just grab the vanilla, because in draft, vanilla can be beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. It gives you the base to build off everything else, doesn't it? The vanilla flavor lets you explore all other than avenues without too much cross-pollination. Hey, mate, as always, an absolute pleasure to talk about another player that's been added to the 50 most relevant, our number 28. I'm sure we'll have you back throughout the preseason talking strategy, players, and a whole lot more coming here from the Coaches Panel.
Sounds good, mate. Thanks for having me on.
Absolute pleasure. If you want to go and check out that article, it doesn't exist. We're not doing articles in 2025. It's all video. It's all audio podcasts. If you want to go and watch this episode or any of the other episodes we've dropped of the 50 most relevant, we've done our best 22s across the format, a great conversation with Dylan Alexander about the best rookies. It is all on our YouTube channel. You can go and check out if you haven't subscribed. Make sure you do so. And if you don't want to watch it, you can still subscribe to it on YouTube Music, listen to the podcast there, or wherever else you get your audio podcast from. You can subscribe and check out those podcasts. And if you haven't given a 5-star rating, we'd love for you to do so. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, you can actually leave a nice little comment. You do that, I'll read it out for you at the end of one of these podcasts if you are lucky. Inside the description of this episode are all the details where you can get in touch with us across social media, where you can find out how you get your hands on some Coaches Panel merch. If you order it in the next couple of weeks, we guarantee it'll be there for when lockout lifts. You'll be able to wear your Coaches Panel merch, whether it be the caps, the hoodies, the shirts, whatever you like. There is a bunch of stuff that you would look real nice in, and you'll be supporting the Coaches Panel. And details to become a Patreon as well. Our breakout and premium tier Patreons are getting this audio podcast a day early. But if you're at any tier level of Coaches Panel, Patreon supporting, you actually can go back in time and get access to a series that was released late in 2024. I recorded it with Kane, and it was all about our top 50 keeper ranks. It was looking at the top 8 tiers of how we've built our keeper rankings and who we would pick and why. Here's a little nugget of gold I'll give you from the series. We've never shared the list publicly, but I'll say this to you. Dylan Moore was our top ranked forward in a keeper league. Yeah, big call when you got Bailey Smith, Horn Francis. Why? Well, become a Patreon, sign up, go back and listen to not only that episode, but the whole 8-episode series, because we explain why and where we had him ranked at the end of the 2024 season. All right, go and get that. Details in the description. Would you like a clue about who's next? Let's give you one. This player came back from injury last year and wasn't exactly setting the world on fire. But his end of year was undeniable. His undeniable value, if the way he ended 2024 becomes the new normal for 2025. There's a couple of little hurdles we've got to overcome to give ourselves a reason to pick him, despite when I say his name tomorrow and I say, yep, is he headed back to what he ended the year? You'd probably say yes, and yet still you might have some reservations to start him. He's relevant in many, many ways. Who are we talking about? Yeah, we'll talk with you tomorrow about that player.